And I decided to go with something that would be a little bit fun and seasonal and figure out with you where our holiday seasons came from. And when you really start drilling down into it, it's a really wonderful story. But to begin with, we have to imagine ourselves as people living in European communities over 2,000 years ago. Small hunter-gathering, small agricultural communities. Very rural, a bit primitive, and tied to the seasons very closely. And remember that we as Homo sapiens are active in the daytime. We are diurnal. And so most of us are not real comfortable being out there at night. Even as you walked in, some people said, oh, you know, it's pretty dark out there. You have a couple lights out, so I put out more candles. We don't hunt at night. We don't go out and do our work at night. We go to sleep. And so think about these very early groups of people living close to the land who saw the amount of daylight shrinking day by day by day as fall came on and winter arrived. Now, the annual cycle told them that the sun was going to come back and the days were going to get longer and they could plant their crops again and find an easier time to hunt. But when the winter came, they were edgy. And so they celebrated the shortest day of the year, the winter solstice, because it was a time when they knew the sun was going to come back and the days were going to get longer. And the way that they celebrated was to push the darkness back. They would go out and cut a huge oak tree. So they had a massive log that would burn for 12 full days. In Scandinavia and in the Norse area, the word Jula was wheel of the year, and so the log that they cut and burned for 12 days was a Yule log, meant to push back the darkness. They also looked for things that represented light, and symbolism for them were things like evergreen trees, holly, ivy, things that didn't lose their leaves even in the heart of winter, that were evergreen, ever living. And they would cut great evergreen boughs or whole trees and drag them into their homes. It probably smelt a little bit better than they did too. In the Celtic regions, in what we now know as the United Kingdom, the Druids or priests of the Celtic tribes would also cut evergreens, and they cut this interesting parasitic plant or semi-parasitic plant called mistletoe that would magically appear in the boughs of oak trees and apple trees. Now, scientists have learned that birds eat the sticky seeds of mistletoe, and when they excrete, the seeds have gone right through their digestive system and get planted on a branch in the bird excrement, a nice plop of fertilizer, and they grow. But the Druids didn't know that. They just saw the mistletoe appear and grow without roots, without nourishment from the soil. It must be magical. It must be mystical. And it stayed green all year, so it was a symbol of fertility and everlasting life. So they cut the mistletoe also. And they also burned logs, anything to push back the darkness. Now, their ceremonies for cutting mistletoe were interesting. The Druids would put on white robes and carry a gold sickle out and whack that mistletoe off of the oak tree, which was a symbol of male fertility. So it was almost like they were emasculating the old king, making way for the new king and the new season. They would cut the mistletoe in winter and summer, hang it in their doorways, hang it from the ceiling to ward off evil. In Scandinavia, it was also a plant of peace, so you could declare a truce under mistletoe. If man and wife were arguing, they could make up under the mistletoe. Mistletoe was also part of the ceremony and the celebration of the winter solstice in the Roman Empire. Back in, this is 200 years before Christ, they celebrated the solstice by honoring their god Saturn. Saturn was one of the Titans. Saturn was the father of the great god Jupiter. Saturn was the god of agriculture, so we're back to fertility. These were not quiet celebrations. These were week-long feasts with a heck of a lot of drinking, probably more than kissing under the mistletoe. Many virgins waited there to find their man. There was gambling, and one thing that's interesting, this was also a time in the festival when slaves were treated with more respect. They were not punished. Sometimes they were fed better. So they had these week-long orgies. Now, to understand where this goes, we have to understand how these ancient civilizations marked time. Even though we're dealing with many centuries ago, we know that many of the Greeks and Romans were astute observers of nature, studied astronomy, studied plants, studied animals, knew the seasons, and established a calendar. Julius Caesar introduced the Julian calendar in 45 BC. It was based on a 12-month year with 365.25 days. They had leap year in it, and it shifted the winter solstice to December 25. So on the 25th of December, for the next week to 12 days, that's when all of these ceremonies and celebrations and Saturnalia took place. However, the Julian calendar was not quite accurate. And in 1582, Pope Gregory XIII instituted the new Gregorian calendar, which corrected some of the errors in the old Julian calendar. They actually deleted 16 days out of the calendar to get it back so that the vernal equinox occurred in mid-March. Why was this important to Pope Gregory? The most important feast for the early Catholic Church was not the Nativity, it was Easter, the resurrection. And they wanted the resurrection to occur in time with the vernal equinox to offset pagan celebrations of spring fertility. They wanted that Christian celebration to occur in concert with the vernal equinox. And we still time the arrival with Easter by a calculation of the full moon and when the vernal equinox hits. So it's still important to the Christian churches in establishing where Easter will fall each year. So Pope Gregory introduced the Gregorian calendar. It corrected the Julian calendar problems. It moved the vernal equinox back to around March 15th, and it also shifted the winter solstice back around December 21st. So it no longer landed on the 25th of December. As I said, the early Catholic Church did not celebrate the Nativity. Part of the problem was you can read the Bible cover to cover, and nowhere in the Bible does it give you a reference to the day when Christ was born. You can't find it. The Nativity is only mentioned in two Gospels, Luke's and Matthew's. There are clues, but the clues do not direct us to December as the time when Christ was born. Probably the spring. As Luke said, the shepherds were in the fields at night watching their flocks. History tells us the only time they went into the fields and spent the night there was in the spring, when the ewes were lambing, to protect those newborn lambs. Matthew talks about when the Magi would arrive, but we haven't quite figured out how long after Christ's birth that actually was, unless we time it with the infanticide put on by King Herod. But it doesn't tell us when Jesus was born. In history, there was no celebration of the Nativity documented until 336 in the Common Era, or AD. And we know then that the Nativity was celebrated for the first time in the Roman Church, Roman Catholic Church. It wasn't until 9 years later that Pope Julius I decided that Jesus' birthday was in fact December 25th. And that was calculated because what the church wanted to do was shift the focus from pagan rituals associated with the winter solstice to a Christian celebration of Christ's birth. In 529, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian actually declared the Feast of the Nativity as a civic holiday. So businesses closed, except bakeries, who would bake special breads for the celebration of the Nativity. What's really interesting is that in 1601, Gregory I actually worked very hard to try and assimilate pagan traditions into a religious observance of the Nativity. They knew that they were not going to get people to stop having parties, having feasts, drinking, taking a holiday, but that they could moderate those behaviors by putting a Christian focus on them. Arthur Weigel, and a man who studied antiquities in Egypt, deciphered some of Gregory's letters. And this is the quote that comes from it. The effort was not to stop ancient pagan festivals, but to adapt them to the rites of the church, only changing the reason of them from heathen to a Christian impulse. And really, it was a good idea. So what we're going to see now is how some of those medieval customs start to shift and evolve, and they hung together for over 1,000 years, so that now we're still doing them. We know that people were still bringing evergreens into the house. Think of a stuffy cottage with a lot of smoke in it, where people are not bathing, where there are stale cooking odors, where bedding hasn't been changed. You bring fresh evergreens in the house. It has to be invigorating. The Christian tradition then began to hang apples on those trees. The apple was a symbol of Eden, of Adam and Eve. Remember what happened. The trees became paradise trees. The apples looked good, red against green. And over time, they evolved into ornaments that we still hang on the trees today. I found it interesting that the word wassail does not necessarily mean a concoction that we drink, but rather, if we go way back into the origins of the word, the Anglo-Saxon pagan ritual was Wes Puhal, be thou hail. It was a way of going door to door singing or wassailing, wishing someone well, and it was done on the 12th night after the solstice, which just happens to be January 5th, which later became our celebration of the Epiphany. Wassailing was a reciprocal exchange between feudal lords and peasants. They were giving one another blessings as opposed to begging. You know the words. We are not daily beggars that beg from door to door, but we are friendly neighbors that you have seen before. Love and joy come to you, and to you your wassail too, and God bless you and send you a happy new year. We still sing the words today. The symbolism continued to evolve. Bunches of evergreens, whether they were holly, ivy, or pine boughs, could be put into a circle or a wreath. We know that Romans hung wreaths on their doors and put wreaths on their heads. A wreath was symbolic. It was the ever-running circle, the circle of life, eternity. And when you had evergreen wreaths, it was eternal life. If we flip that wreath on its side and put candles in it to drive past the dark, we have an Advent wreath. Advent wreaths became popular in the early Lutheran Church as a way of marking the time before Christ's arrival, the Nativity. The symbols were the same, they were just massaged differently and given a Christian representation. One of the important figures in history, a real person, whose character became tied to the celebration of Christ's birth, was Nicholas. Nicholas lived from 270 to 343 AD. He was a 4th century Greek bishop in a region that we now know as Turkey. He was from Myra in Lycia. He had a reputation for secret gift giving. He was a man of financial means. His family had money. There are lots of legends about Nicholas. Many were documented enough that he was canonized a saint within 100 years after his death, December the 6th. He had a reputation, they said, for leaving coins in shoes that were left out for him. There are also stories that he helped young women who had no dowries. At that time, if a woman was too poor to have a dowry, her fate was to become a prostitute. To save her from that unholy lifestyle, Nicholas was known to put a sack of coins in the window for that young lady. Now, some people stretched the story a little farther and said he tossed the coins, the sack of coins, into the house and it went down the chimney. He tossed the coins, the sack of coins, into the house and it landed in her stocking. Legend, fact, the story stuck. But what we know is that Nicholas was generous. He had a generous spirit, and his feast day became December the 6th. The legends and stories that surrounded Nicholas became absorbed in those other European communities and mixed with their pagan roots, and new characters were evolved. So in Austria and Bavaria, Nicholas, who was known to give gifts to those who were worthy, who were well-behaved children, was balanced with his new traveling partner, Krampus, who was a monster. And if a child hadn't been good, Krampus made sure that their parents got a switch to beat them with. Or he carried a burlap sack to steal them away. And so children were terrified of Krampus if he walked in the door, but looked forward to Nicholas because he would give them apples, coins, and little gifts. In Scandinavia, one of the pagan gods was Odin, a bearded man, a man of the woods, like in Scandinavia, who flew through the night on a gray horse named Sleipnir, And that horse had 8 legs. Wasn't it amazing that when St. Nicholas started to visit houses in Europe, he rode a white horse that traveled on the rooftops? Amazing how they could fly. Another Christian legend, based in fact, or another Christian tradition, finds its roots in St. Francis of Assisi. We know St. Francis for many things. For Christmas, he originated the crèche, or the nativity scene. In 1223, in Greccio, Italy, he assembled in a cave an ox and a lamb and a sheep, and adults who dressed in the parts of Mary and Joseph and the shepherds, and they staged a live nativity. He actually asked for permission to do it. He was a very deeply religious man. He wanted to focus the celebration of Christmas on worshiping Christ, not on the secular gift-giving aspects of the season. Pope Honorius III gave his blessing to the live nativities. There are accounts written that Francis actually wept when he was in the live nativity, and he preached the gospel there. The tradition of making little manger scenes, little nativities and creches has continued since then, and within 100 years of Francis's beginning this practice, every church in Italy had a nativity scene. And then there's the stuff we eat. Interesting beginnings. I wanted to know, where did things like gingerbread and fruitcake and candy canes come from? Well, ginger was a root that was imported from Asia to Europe way back at the time of the Romans. Some accounts say that it was used for medicinal properties, especially if you had an upset stomach. Some people indicated that it was used as a preservative. It made things last longer. And some said that it was just tasty. Now, the earliest gingerbread, ladies, you're going to want to write this recipe down, was breadcrumbs mixed with honey and ground ginger. Yum. Later, the honey was replaced with treacle, or a sugar syrup or molasses, and eventually flour was substituted for the breadcrumbs, and then some wise woman had the great idea of throwing a couple of eggs into the batch to make a lighter, fluffier concoction. But gingerbread was made into shapes and sold at fairs in early markets in England and in Europe. People loved it. It is believed that Elizabeth I surprised her dinner guests with little gingerbread men, fashioned to look like each of her guests. They were just thrilled. So gingerbread men have been around since early times. Fruitcake is equally old. The Romans made cakes that included pomegranates, pine nuts, and raisins mixed with barley mash. They added honey and spices and preserved fruits in the Middle Ages. It is said that the early Crusaders carried fruitcakes in their parcels because it lasted so long and it tasted so good. By the 1400s, the British had started to make fruitcake with dried Mediterranean fruits. And in the 1700s, Europeans made fruitcake following the nut harvest. And then they would save some of it to the next season. In the early 18th century, plum cakes or fruit cakes were so delicious that in continental Europe they were outlawed because they were sinfully rich. Between 1837 and 1901, they were incredibly popular in England. They were a standard in Victorian teas. So whenever the ladies had tea, which was daily, they would have fruit cake. Queen Victoria waited 1 year to eat a fruit cake given to her on her birthday because she said it showed restraint and dignity. I think she was in there probably pinching off crumbs. So we know fruit cake has been around for a long time. We can figure out pretty much when candy canes were invented. They were invented by a choir master in the Cologne Cathedral in Germany about 1670. He took a sugar stick that was white and bent it with a crook on it. They were supposed to look like shepherd's staffs, and he gave them to children so that they would hush up during the very long nativity ceremonies. It worked so well that churches everywhere started giving kids candy canes to suck on in church so they would behave. The custom just spread. Remember that they were all white. The first American reference to a candy cane was in 1847 when a German immigrant decorated a tree in Worcester, Ohio, with white candy canes. I'm not sure if that story is entirely accurate, but it sounds about right for immigrants bringing these traditions to this country. We know that the stripes were added after 1900, and that was also the time when they added peppermint or wintergreen flavoring to the candy and made it more than just sweet. Christmas did not have a continued history, though. There are some periods of time when it was not celebrated. A wave of religious reform changed Christmas in Europe when Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans forces took over England around 1645. They did not like the celebrations, the feasting, the drinking, the singing, the jovialness of the holiday. They wanted to eliminate any decadence, and so Christmas was canceled. It wasn't until Charles II came back that quickly Christmas was reinstated. But when the Puritans, seeking religious freedom, came to the New World, they brought with them the dislike for Christmas because it reminded them of the Church of England and its traditions. They noted that December 25th was not listed in the Bible as the date of Christ's birth, and that holidays that involve drinking, games, and feasts should be outlawed. And so they made celebrating Christmas a punishable offense. If you were found celebrating the holiday, you would be fined 5 shillings. That law was put into effect May 11th, 1659, and it stayed in force for a good 20 years. Now, in other colonies, Christmas was celebrated, but in Massachusetts Bay Colony, it was not. Really, when our nation was first established, we sort of eschewed old European and English traditions. They fell out of favor and fashion, and Christmas was one of them. That just fell by the wayside. Believe it or not, Congress was in session on December 25th, 1789, the first Christmas under the new Constitution. It was just another day. Our country simply did not celebrate it. So there was a period of time when our country was very young that Christmas was not observed. Really, Americans reinvented Christmas in their own way in the early 19th century. From a more raucous festival to something that was family-centered and focused on peace and nostalgia. Part of the focus of this was wealthy landowners did not want people celebrating in the street. They had property. Their houses had value. They worried about damage. So if Christmas could be retooled into a quiet, peaceful indoor celebration, their property was less at risk. That was the way we wanted to celebrate Christmas. And one of the early American writers who helped us with that concept was Washington Irving. His writing influenced and supported the concept. Now, Washington Irving, although he was an American, moved to England in 1815 to work in his family business, which promptly went bankrupt. He decided not to return home, but to stay in England and try and make something of himself as a writer, and he wrote, "I am determined not to return home until I have sent some writings before me that shall, if they have merit, make me return to smiles, rather than sulk back to the pity of my friends." Between 1818 and 1819, he finished a series of short stories under the pen name Geoffrey Crayon, and it was called The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. There were 33 stories in it. What's amazing is he's an American, but only 5 of them dealt with American subjects. And 2 of those stories were 2 that we still know very well today, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. Also in the sketchbook were 5 stories about Christmas. And they were focused on how people in the English countryside celebrated Christmas, these wonderful, nostalgic family celebrations. Well, his book caught on incredibly, and he and James Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales were the most widely read works of American literature in Britain and England. And Washington Irving became a very famous man and did very, very well. But when the books were sold in the United States, they influenced how people started having family celebrations. Slowly but surely, Christmas was re-recognized in the United States. Alabama was the first state to legalize the celebration of Christmas. At this time, remember, before then, Americans worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week. December 25th was just another work day. 1836, Alabama legalized Christmas. 1870, Christmas was declared a federal holiday. It wasn't until 1907 that Oklahoma at last recognized Christmas as a holiday. So it was a slow pattern of embracing it. There were a couple of writers and illustrators, though, who really defined Christmas for us. The most important, I think, or one of the most important, and the first, was obviously Clement Clarke Moore. He gave Americans our version of Santa Claus. He was born in 1779, and he was the son of an heiress. He came from a wealthy family. Charity Clark was his mother. Dr. Benjamin Moore was his father. Benjamin Moore was the rector of Trinity Church in New York, and he was the president of Columbia College. So Clement Clarke Moore grew up with a great education, and he became a real scholar. He was a professor of Oriental and Greek literature. He was a professor of divinity and biblical learning. He translated languages. He was an incredibly brilliant man. And what is he known for? In 1822, when he was 43 years old, he wrote a little 53-line poem for his children called A Visit from St. Nicholas, which we know as The Night Before Christmas. He never acknowledged that he was the author until he was 65 years old. He was embarrassed that he was more popular and better known for this little poem that he wrote for children than he was for all of this scholarly work that he had done. There is anecdotal information that suggests that a friend of the family named Harriet Butler took the poem and had it published in 1823. And it spread like wildfire. But he never actually published it himself until he was 65 years old. Regardless, he gave us our version of Santa Claus. 'Twas the night before Christmas went all through the house. And every one of us knows that poem by heart and probably has read it to our children. 20-some years later, an incredible author named Charles Dickens wrote another story. He wrote A Christmas Carol in 1843. And it rekindled the joy that Christmas is supposed to bring. He rekindled it in Britain and in the United States when the traditions of celebrations had declined. Dickens said he wished to strike a hammer's blow for the poor. when he wrote about Ebenezer Scrooge and Bob Cratchit and the visits of the three spirits. He said that he wept and laughed and wept again as the story unfolded under his pen. And at night, he walked the streets of London, the darkest alleys. He walked them alone so that he really could experience what the poor experienced, and he could put that in his story. His Ghost of Christmas Present resembles Santa Claus a great deal. But remember, these men created images with words. Americans did not yet have a visual of Santa Claus, only the pictures painted with words. And St. Nicholas and Sinterklaas had always been tall, thin men, sometimes with a beard, sometimes without. Then there was a man named Thomas Nast. Now, Nast was the person who drew Santa Claus for us. He was a German-born American. He was a caricaturist and an editorial cartoonist by trade. He is known as the father of the American cartoon. He is the man who created our modern version of Santa and Uncle Sam, and he gave us two political symbols, the Republican elephant and the Democratic donkey. He drew for Harper's Weekly from 1859 to 1860, and then after a break in Europe, he drew again for Harper's Weekly between 1862 and 1886. He was known for his fiery caricatures. He was known for his political opinions. He was incredibly influential in the written press. And in 1863, in the heart of the Civil War, he drew this picture of Santa Claus. And it stuck. Santa was no longer thin, he was plump. He most certainly had a beard, and he had a little pipe, and he wore holly wreaths and fur and a red suit. What's interesting is that when Nast finally retired, he lost his public forum, but the Harper's Weekly lost its life. He truly was the life of the publication. A few years later, Santa acquired a wife. Now, various writers have alluded to Santa's wife as early as 1849. They are generally in very small publications, publications that were not widely circulated, and they were one-liners. However, Catherine Lee Bates popularized the concept of Mrs. Claus in her poem, Goody Santa Claus in a Sleigh Ride. I have the poem. It's about 2.5 pages long, and Goody is the name of Mrs. Claus. And she wrangles a ride in the sleigh, and she's quite opinionated and quite bossy and basically is responsible for a lot of Santa Claus's success. But then we knew that anyway, right? This postcard that you see on the screen appeared in 1919. So by then, we gave Mrs. Claus a personality and a persona, and she's generally a bit plump, like Santa, gray-haired, sweet, and a lot of times carrying a plate of cookies or helping out an elf. Another Christmas tradition that we have that I must admit I enjoyed personally growing up was the song Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and the story of Rudolph. Because in the night before Christmas, there was no Rudolph. Rudolph was created in 1939 by Robert May for Montgomery Ward's department store. Montgomery Ward's had been buying and giving away coloring books during the Christmas season for a number of years. They wanted to save money, so they decided if they created their own book, they could save money. Robert said that he had to think about what he was going to name his character with the red nose. He considered Rollo, he considered Reginald, and then he finally settled on Rudolph. I think that was a good choice. And 2.4 million copies were distributed the first year. It was a real success. Now, May's brother-in-law was a man named Johnny Marks, and Johnny Marks adapted the poem into a song. He was a radio producer and a composer. He was a graduate of Colgate College and a World War II hero with a Bronze Star. But we remember him for the song he wrote. And remember really Gene Autry singing the song. That record was released on November 25th in 1949. And I think we're still listening to it on the radio every year. So you can see how centuries of saints, pagan myths, and stories help to nurture these pictures of Santa Claus that are so vivid in our Christmas heritage. Santa with 8 reindeer. Is it a coincidence that he has 8 reindeer and Splintner had 8 legs? Is it a coincidence that Splintner flew through the sky and St. Nicholas suddenly had a horse that jumped from rooftop to rooftop? That Santa carries a list about naughty and nice children. We've replaced the ogre, Krampus, with little elves, but he still has helpers. And the whole thing with the chimney goes back to a saint who put coins in shoes through sacks of coins in windows. The Christmas tree. We couldn't have Christmas without a tree, could we? We know that the idea of bringing evergreens in goes back to the Norse, to the Germans, to that idea of bringing life and the great scent into the house. We also know that Martin Luther decorated a tree in 1510 with candles so his children could imagine the stars in the sky. We know that the whole idea of having a decorated tree really caught fire, if you will, in England in 1846. Queen Victoria had married her German Prince Albert and encouraged him to bring some of the German traditions that he had enjoyed as a young man into their home. And in 1846, a live cut tree was decorated in their palace for their children to enjoy. This picture, it was done from a woodcut, was published in the London News with the family around the tree. Within 2 years later, everybody in London wanted a Christmas tree. And if you notice, 1846, it took less than 20 years for the tradition to catch hold in this country. And the quintessential picture of the Victorian Christmas celebration, that family celebration inside, focused on family and nostalgia, had in fact happened. Exactly the way Pope Gregory wanted it hundreds of years before. The Victorians loved to make Christmas ornaments. It was a craft for the ladies. They made lace, they cut ribbons, they glued paper flowers, they imported tinsel, which was extruded silver, hung it on the trees. The Germans were exceptionally gifted at blowing glass ornaments, and that became a growing industry for them, and people bought imported ornaments. We still do today. And then the whole idea of lights. We're pushing the dark back. We're still pushing the dark back. They started with candles, but you know, you had to light them and then watch them so that the whole thing didn't go up and you had more light than you wanted. When Edison invented the electric light bulb, it was only a couple of years later where they knew there was a market to put lights on trees. But quite frankly, the first electric Christmas lights were so complicated you had to hire an electrician to put them on your tree. And they were extremely expensive. But the technology improved, And soon, large, heavier Christmas lights were there, and you could clip them on the tree, and they worked. One of the big breakthroughs or changes was the invention of the bubble light by Pneuma. And actually there were a couple different companies that came up with the technology, but Pneuma was the one that caught on in the United States, or Noma. Basically, there was a vial filled with methylene chloride, and the incandescent light under it heated that liquid and caused it to boil and to bubble. And people just loved them. They were marketed in this country. They were first seen by the Tellson Electric Company in the late 1920s in England, and then the technology was patented by Carl Otis in 1944 and introduced in the United States in 1946 by Noma. And I had one aunt that always had bubble lights on her tree. I remember it very clearly growing up. And then we shrunk the sides of the lights and we got little twinkle lights. And I think probably for most dads who help put up Christmas trees, or moms that put up trees, the greatest invention was a shunt. You know, this is the typical light, just that little light with the filament, but when they came up with the shunt, basically the shunt is this little crossbar. It was coated, it was iodized wire. So when the filament blew out, it heated that coating on the wire and caused it to burn off, and then the electricity went through the shunt, which meant that one light could burn out, but the rest of the strand didn't. And weren't you happy? Absolutely. And so, Christmas trees, brilliantly lit, inside and outside, became a standard for our holiday celebrations. We weren't content to have them on the trees. We put them everywhere. And really, as you drive through the cities, as you drive through your subdivisions and you see the lights of Christmas, is it any different than those Norse people thinking of the coldest, darkest days of the year and looking for the light and pushing the darkness back? And so, I wish you a good solstice, a happy holiday, and Merry Christmas. Thank you so much.